Hello, welcome everybody. This is the Mastering AppDynamics track. We are at the last session of the day before the closing keynote. We've saved a great session. This is the Mastering APM with end user monitoring. We have one of our product managers here who is in charge of mobile and IoT. His name is Anupam Jindal, and he's great. And he's going to tell you about how you can leverage our end user monitoring with APM to get true end-to-end visibility. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Anupam.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Now let's have everybody come here and introduce themselves. That'll cover like 40 minutes of our sessions, and then we'll only have time for Q&A. All I want to do is understand your background. So raise your hand if you have experience working with mobile teams, have worked in mobile teams, have used our mobile products. A few. And what about browser? Okay, a lot more. Thank you. Helps me understand how quickly or how should I pace my conversations here. So here's the agenda for today. I'll do some ground setting, talk about skyscraper buildings, apartments, condos. Don't worry, you're in the right session. I'll only use those as analogies to set up what the world out is like today, what are the users like, and what do they expect. Then we'll look at some of the future, how are organizations transforming themselves, how can you bring that transformation, and I'll try to make a case that using end-user monitoring, you can answer some questions that will help you move to the future of development. Okay, that covered. Last night I was walking in London, and I was walking in London. I was walking for food. Essentially, I saw some big buildings. I noticed an interesting stuff. This is my second trip to London. I was here a month ago as well. And I love the city. I love it because it's a perfect combination of a heritage, a royal heritage, and progressiveness. So you have buildings that are good old brick buildings, and at the same time you have glass buildings that are very futuristic. And I saw these buildings, I said, these are amazing piece of work. These are amazing piece of engineering. And what makes them interesting is that they're a foundation. And this foundation lives under the ground. So people buying apartments, condos, office space, or using those spaces don't even realize that the most important part of these buildings is the foundation of these buildings. And I relate this foundation in our software world or in our IT world to the backend. The backend is more like Java, .NET, with thousands of servers, databases, on-prem deployment, cloud deployment, world changing every day. But that's your foundation. Your users never come to your website or your mobile app asking a question of, how's your foundation? They just assume that it works, and it works great. Right? And you have your foundation covered, I hope in most cases, through APM. The APM gives you a great view of flow maps. You can drill down. You looked at the keynote today with the baseline IQ, diagnostic IQ, map IQ, business IQ. It covers your bases around the core of the application, core of the foundation. That's the most important part. But today I'm going to talk more about the end-user monitoring. So when we look at the large buildings, let's say you go and buy a place in one of these large buildings or tall buildings. One of the most important part you look at is the floor plan. You look at floor plan because it should be easily accessible from one part of the apartment or condo to other parts. It should be flexible enough for your needs so when your family grows, you can adapt to it. And it should be simple. The other thing that's important when you go buy a place is the aesthetics of this building or this apartment. It should look beautiful. If I convert this to our software world, I treat floor plan almost as if a user experience flow. when a user is going from one part of your application to other part, whether it's on browser, mobile, or any other device, they're hoping to achieve a goal. They're hoping for a simple accessibility, flexibility when they need to change things. Similarly, for the aesthetics, I treat it as like Apple's products, right? The product's so beautiful that you would want to use them. Their phones are so beautiful. Their other products are so beautiful that you would want to use them. You would want to purchase them. I relate it to screen aesthetics on the mobile applications or browser applications. So it should look beautiful, it should look simple. So now that we understand that the user is not focused on the foundation or on the back end, they're actually focused on achieving their own goals. Let's see who these users are. And today's user is not just the desktop users. We all know that the world is changing very fast. It's evolving very fast. People are on mobile phones, virtual reality, IoT devices. I have a funny story with this camera. And I was looking at a company about 2 years ago, just trying to invest in companies as a venture fund. And this company is working on very interesting technology, which is it gives you a memory chip that goes into your camera, and it uploads the picture as you take them in real time to cloud, and suggests you edits on how you should take the picture. Right? That's pretty amazing. Right? So with all these devices proliferating, the user stays same. This is the same user who was on desktop, who used to be on desktop, is now going to mobile, now going to virtual reality, now going to IoT devices. And there's a very interesting aspect to that. The interesting aspect is that the user behavior changes even for the same user across different platforms. They expect one thing from one platform and another thing from a different platform. So I used to work for e-commerce company. And this e-commerce company, we saw that the conversion rate on desktops were about 4%, versus on mobile it was about 1.5%. So there was a huge difference. Now on the browser was probably better conversion because you could show a lot of recommendation. You had a lot of screen real estate where you would show these recommendations, bundle up the product. You have higher cart value, and you have better conversions as a result. Versus on the mobile, because the screen space is very limited, you're only showing and focusing on achieving one goal for your users. So again, this is the same user. And this user is expecting two different things for two different platforms. So I want to take an example from AppDynamics perspective. In this example, we'll take a look at how do you look at these user flows and interaction with the application. So what we are looking at over here are Kyle, who's our user for today. We are looking at Kyle's sessions through last 1 week. And when I say sessions, these are essentially customer journeys. Every time somebody opens an application on mobile app or on browser, it counts as a new customer journey. And when it ends, that's when it counts as finished. So there are quite a few sessions from Kyle. When I click on one of these, this is the view I get. And on the left side, you have the screens Kyle used. So I started with the login screen, onto list, cart view, and then checkout. Here's the user interaction, which is Kyle was clicking on buttons, could be selecting text fields, could be selecting table cells, so on. And the interesting aspect is this particular network request is taking quite a bit of time to execute. It's taking almost about 21 seconds to execute. That's quite slow performance. A study tells that if somebody has bad experience with your mobile application, 83% of the time, they will drop out of your application and never come back. This is a staggering percentage. So having such a slow experience, you would almost feel like your application is hung. And sure enough, when I look at here, small, but what it says is this 23rd session of 23 total sessions from Kyle, which tells me that Kyle has not returned to my application since. So Kyle couldn't complete the checkout and hasn't returned. So he probably dropped out of the application. So what we essentially did here is looked at the user flow, looked at Kyle's user flow, and identified the interaction with the application and correlated it with the code at the same time. I have a funny thing, which is when Jyoti Bansal started AppDynamics, he used to talk a lot about watching every single line of code execution, which AppDynamics does now. In your backend, in your mobile app, in your browser, all your platforms, you're watching every single line of code as it executes to build interesting insights out of it. But as the world evolved over past 9 years, we said that's not enough. We not only want to capture every single line of code execution, we also want to capture every single user interaction, and we want to capture every single device communication, and connect all these data points together to tell you a full story. Tell you a story that's not only about performance of your application, but it's also about your business impact. It's also about a story of a user that you have. Let's move forward in this example as you dive deeper into why the checkout call is too slow. You get to the backend, you find out that this particular JDBC call or this particular database call happens to be quite slow, and that's what's causing the problem. So quickly identify the root cause and resolve the issue. That's essentially what users are looking for you to do. Okay, so far we have talked about the state of things as it stands today. We have talked about users, what do they expect, what kind of platforms they are on, and how do their behaviors change across these platforms. And that's all great. It's all great because you already knew this stuff. So I didn't tell you any groundbreaking stuff. What I want to tell you is, how does that affect your organization? How does that affect the whole industry? As the users are changing, we often say, my users are now on mobile as well, let's start supporting mobile. And then they are also on Apple Watches, or they're also on another device, let's start supporting that. But is that the right solution? So I'll try to make a case that the future of organizations would be very different. Let's start talking about that. One thing I think will happen is the data mining team would become very central. Right now, when in many companies, the data scientists and data engineers are assigned to each types of team. So there will be one group of those for mobile team, one group of those for marketing, another for product, another for browser, and so on. And they're all looking at the data in a siloed way. But those teams will become central because essentially all these pieces are connected. So many functions may disappear. For example, marketing analytics, product analytics, and application performance may all combine together to form a common data team. And that will happen because your user is same, your company's goals are same. Those goals could be increasing profits, could be increasing revenue, could be increasing number of users, reducing costs, but it's the one goal that the marketing team is trying to achieve, that the product team is trying to achieve, and that your developer should be trying to achieve. So when you're looking at these data points, it needs to tell an end-to-end story. And that's why the organizations need to evolve. And then there will be an increased role of operations and developers. I'll talk more about it, but just mention an example. I was talking to one of the large banks here in the UK, and they're already transforming their developer operations. They're bringing DevOps into mobile teams, which is now not only limited to finding issues when somebody reports them, but is also focused on how is my mobile team's operations doing. And as I said, we'll dive deeper into it. But before diving deeper into it, I do want to remind that it's that single thing that's driving all of these changes, which is this user connected to all the different platforms. They're connected to all these different platforms. They're changing their behavior across these platforms, but they are trying to achieve single goal. In order to achieve these goals, the organization needs to come together as a central organization. So some of the companies disrupting the organizational structures, say Cisco. I'm just kidding. I think there are some companies here that are disrupting these structures. I consider AppDynamics to be one of those. Obviously, I'm biased in that case, but there are other ones as well, like Fastlane, which helps you do automation of your builds, Amplitude, trying to do cohort analysis, trying to do predictive analysis of what would happen in future with your applications. Xamarin, which is a common way of developing your code across multiple mobile platforms, so you don't have to have a team for mobile, team for iOS, team for Android, and so on. So these are some of the companies that are trying to change how organizations are structured. And what that means is completely different development style. Current development style, as I said, is siloed development style. In many organizations, the mobile team is almost never talking to browser team. The browser team is almost never talking to an IoT team. And they are rarely talking to the backend team other than accessing their APIs and talking to them when something goes wrong. But there would not be any more disconnected development, because every single user is interacting with you with multiple platforms, but with the same goal. And then operations have an expanded role. Operations have an expanded role because their role is no longer just to identify issues as they happen. Their role is to connect the business outcomes to technological implementation and give that insight out to their senior management. This will help bring efficiencies. So there are two ways to bring this change in your organization. One is inside-out approach, which is you would go back to your organization, you would go back to your development team, and you will tell them, AJ said that we need to change our development style, so let's change it. But nobody's going to agree to that. It's very hard to change mindsets. So the other approach is outside-in approach, which is if you ask the right questions, if you try to find out who your users are, where they're struggling, and that use those as proof points to bring the change, it will be much easier. In order to bring this change, the core elements of the outside-in approach are to understand that your consumer app performance affects the user behavior. And user behavior is also impacted by psychology of your user, and that combined with the performance and psychology affects the business impact. So here's where we get to the heart of the presentation today. What are these questions you need to ask in order to bring this change in your organizations? How can end user monitoring help you answer those questions to make you successful in this end-to-end visibility? So here are some questions you need to ask. How are your omni-channel users behaving across different platforms? Are you tracking the right KPIs? Can you quickly resolve issues? What is your MTTI? MTTI means mean time to identification. So how long does it take you to identify an issue? I used to be an engineer before, and I've also worked in the consumer world, as I said, in an e-commerce company. And working there would often be a case where we would take days and thousands of emails just exchanging between different teams, trying to pinpoint where the issue is. But that's almost hurtful. Your users does not understand that you're doing this whole internal process trying to find out what the problem is, while all they care about is how do they check out quickly. Right? Are you solving problem for the right user set? And how are your software applications impacting business outcomes? I'll let you take the screenshot. So if you answer these questions, I'm sure you'll have a better understanding of your users, your business. You'll have better insights into how APM, along with end-user monitoring, could help you get to the next phase where your users are. So let's talk about each of these in more detail. How are your omnichannel users behaving across different platforms? So again, we have sessions from Kyle. Imagine this is a different Kyle. As I explained, the sessions are customer journeys where Kyle has gone through the applications number of times over a time window. So in this session, again, you have on the left side, you have all the screen flows, so the screen that Kyle went through. And on the right side, it's connecting Kyle's interaction with the application, system events like network switches from Wi-Fi to 3G or 4G, and then correlating it with the network request. And you see that the Kyle has used this application about 104 times. It's quite a good number. It makes me believe that Kyle is the most valuable member for this business. Now let's look at what Kyle's sessions look like for browser. So I searched for Kyle here as well. And notice that there is only one session in the same time window. It worries me a little bit, but maybe Kyle just is not as much of a browser user. It's always on mobile. So let's go deeper into this particular session from browser and see how Kyle used this application. And turns out, as you get deeper into it, that there's this one particular cart item call that was quite slow in here. There's a lot of latencies. Tells me Kyle has a bad experience on browser. And maybe that's the reason Kyle doesn't never return back to the browser session, right, for the browser application. So Kyle never came back to the application. I don't have any other sessions from Kyle. And it's an important insight. It's important to understand why your users are moving from one platform to other platform when they start transacting or looking at products in a train and a tube, and move on to their home and finish on browser or any other device. Need to understand why they are doing that. Why don't they finish their transaction on that same device? Or do they try to move across different platforms? What's that driving factor? So we looked at an individual user here. It's also important to look at the things in a perspective of all of your user base set. So on the left side, I have the mobile screen usage. On the right side, I have the browser screen usage. You can clearly know that on the mobile side, the login page is quite heavily used. The usage drops off right after that. So a lot of people probably land on that page, but after that, they drop off. Versus on the browser, it's a pretty even usage. It tells me that my users are probably having a better experience or prefer more on the browser side in this particular case. So while Kyle's session had a bad experience on the browser side, there may be an individual case, but not so much across all the users. So you can't relate the previous causation and correlate it to the problem. But here's where you can tell the full story. Let's move on to the next part. Are you tracking the right KPIs? And when I talk about KPIs here, I'm not only saying the business KPIs, but precisely the performance KPIs. And a lot of different businesses have their own KPIs to look at in terms of the user base, in terms of the conversions, and so on. And that's all important. But can you look at any widget or any dashboard in a second and tell that the application is doing fine or not? That's the KPI I'm talking about. So here's an example. These are the scorecards for mobile. On the left side, you have scorecards across multiple applications for iOS and Android. And you could have as many applications as you want. On the right side, I have a more deep dive into one particular scorecard. But right away, this red mark is telling me that the application is not fine, that there is something wrong. It gives me more details. It tells me that the crash rate is quite high on this application. Also gives me details on HTTP errors, latencies, health rule violations. But just looking at it, I can tell that there is something wrong. I don't have to go through whole network percentile response time. I don't have to go through where my users are, what regions they're having problem in. Yes, I can drill down into it if I have to find more. But when I get to Office or when I'm looking at this dashboard, I should be able to tell, should I be worried, essentially. Similarly, for browser, this particular widget is quite important. It's comparing your synthetic performance to real user performance. And for those of you who don't have experience with synthetic, synthetic is really a way to test your website and calculate average response times across different regions. And across these regions, we do it through setting up robots or bots there that go onto real browsers, test out the application, goes through the whole flow. And comparing these two numbers here, looks like synthetic is actually slower than the real user. And many people would expect that the fake user should be faster. The real users are the ones who don't know how to use the application. We try to mimic as close to the real user as possible, so you don't always have same results, and you can tell a good story here. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. And this next one I want to talk about, can you get to the root cause really quickly? When developers develop applications in all your organizations, they don't do it with bugs in them, at least according to them. They're not trying to introduce bugs. But when it gets to the real users, there's always one thing or the other that's wrong. It happens almost every day in every other organization. Right? So your users are somewhat used to seeing that there can be some issues on the application, especially if they're your long-term users, and they would complain about it. But what they would expect from you is not to ask them questions on what environment you were using, what platform you were using, what was the problem. These users expect you to figure out this problem and solve them very quickly. So let's take an example here. I had set up a synthetic test, which this runs a script through my browser, sends me alerts if something's wrong. So it looks like I got an email alert here. I go to this email alert, tells me exactly what's wrong. It gives me two options. I can look at the session details, or I can look at similar related sessions which have similar problems. I decided to look at the details because I want to find out what's wrong. Go into this, that puts me directly into the session with the details. It tells me the screenshot of what the application looked like when it loaded. It looks like the first page loaded just fine. It shows the full screenshot. On the next part, it tells me that there is something wrong, that there is an error. And that error is that it's timing out. The script is timing out. So within a few seconds, I'm able to tell that even before deploying my new version of application out in the wild, that there is something wrong. Let's take another example. This example is more around mobile. Got an alert, it was an email alert for on the left side that there is a new crash, on the right side saying that your crash rate is higher than normal. Again, it has two buttons. One is to go into the crash details. The other is to go into the session details. I'll choose to go into crash details because I want to look at the stack trace to see where the problem is. And then as I go into the crash details, it gives me the stack trace. It gives me the stack trace in an intelligent way. It doesn't just lays out all the methods that were called. It tries to highlight the ones where it thinks the problem is. So the blue text here is pointing that the problem may exist in one of these lines of code. It's hiding other stuff, but it's still allowing you to explore those if you wanted to. But that's not all. There are thousands of crash solutions out there in the market. There are free ones as well. So what's so special about it? In order to understand that, you need to understand the development. When developers develop an application or a new version of an application, they run a bunch of unit tests. They're trying to make sure that everything is fine. And after they have done that, they pass it on to the QA team. The QA team runs the tests and makes sure everything's fine, there is no bugs. And after all of that has happened, pushes out to production. Right? So essentially, the team has done a fairly good job of making sure that there is nothing wrong with the application. But when it goes out to the production, it still crashes. Right? So when it crashes and user complains either in the App Store or through the customer support comes back to the developer and says, there's something wrong. You should look into it. The developer would go through the same steps, say, I can't reproduce the problem. And because I can't reproduce the problem, it must be a very small problem for a very limited user set, so we don't need to worry about it a lot. And before you know it, the 100 people problem becomes 100,000 people problem, becomes a million people problem. In many cases, becomes CEO problem. Right? So more than understanding the line of code that caused that problem, because that line of code is working fine for a lot of other users, you need to understand how did a user got here. Essentially, how do you reproduce that problem? So when you click on the view session, it takes you to the session, gives you exactly the steps user followed, the environment that user was in, the interaction that the user was doing, the buttons they were clicking on before this crash happened. That tells you a better story. Now you can take these steps, follow exactly same steps, and hopefully the same environment with same connection type, and maybe you have better chances of reproducing this problem. And that's quite important. So again, in this case, you were able to get to the root cause of the problem. You were able to reproduce the problem very quickly from getting an alert. Next, I want to talk about are you solving problems for the right users? As I said, I used to be a PM for a consumer company as well. And even in my current job, I would often get requests, and the tendency would be to say, oh, this sounds quite bad. Let me have somebody look into it right away. So let's look at an example here, and why that may not be the right approach in many cases. So in this example, we are looking at geolocation graph of mobile app performance across the world. Looks like most of the Europe, Asia, Australia is fine, but the US has something in red. And it points out that there is exceptionally high crash rate, shown over on the right side. So I should go chase that problem because there are quite a number of users using my application in the US. So in this case, as soon as you hear about it, you would want to go chase it. Here's a view of where the people are using my application. So when you're fixing a problem and you see that the crash rate is high, if the crash rate happens to be on iPhone 6, but people are using your application across only iPhone 5 or iPhone 7, then it doesn't matter if the problem is on iPhone 6. You could put it as maybe a P2 instead of a P1. I know this is an old screenshot, so it doesn't have iPhone 7s and 6s. But this is the usage of the application across different devices. Now here's a browser geo dashboard. And I've focused only to the European part. And again, in this example, everything looks green except Spain and Greece. And quickly, I notice on the right side that Spain and Greece have quite high response time. It's taking about 2.5 seconds for pages to load. Another study done by Microsoft and Google together suggests that if you make your users wait for more than half a second, you start to impact your revenue. Half a second. It's quite a number. And this is 2.5 seconds. Right? But if you look at the bottom part, the highest page requests, none of those are from Spain and Greece. So in this particular case, although the problem seems quite severe, that there are 2 whole countries where the problem exists, it may not be as important for you to look at right away. Again, you have the segmentation of the browsers here, but through these 2 points, you'd want to make sure that you understand where your users are. I'd only taken one example, but you need to know where your users exist. You need to know the platforms they exist on, how they use your application. Then I'll talk about this business impact. You've all looked at the business IQ earlier this morning, building the funnels, building the metrics, setting up alerts. Well, a lot of that data is driven through end-user monitoring. If you're missing end-user monitoring in your product set, then you're losing the view of users. You're only looking at the code visibility. So here's an example. This one, I'm looking at the conversion in UK to change address. So somebody going from main screen to change address is a country selection, and the total conversion rate is about 10%. The way I build this funnel is by saying, give me all the users who go onto the main screen, then give me the ones who went onto the cart view screen, and once on the cart view, they were trying to change their address to ship to a different place. And only 10% people do that. So when you see a problem in that area, or when you're trying to decide the next feature set, you need to take that into account. You need to know that if only 10% users are using it, yes, it's a quite high number, but maybe you should focus your energy on the rest of the 90% use cases first, and then come to the 10%. Okay. Here's another one. And I should have built a better graph with overlapping the two metric. What it's trying to tell me is often the problems happen when you release a new version. So on the left side, it's telling me 2.0 version crash trend. On the right side, it's telling me 1.0 crash trend. And although the graphs look very similar, if you look at the scale on the y-axis, on a 1.0, I only had about an average of 1,250 crashes. And that's per day. On the 2.0, that number is about 2,500. So the crash rate has doubled after I released a new version. It's important to understand from your business perspective, from your user's perspective, that as you release new versions, are you tracking those KPIs across versions? Here's an example of cellular versus Wi-Fi response time. I've seen this often that when you go to developers and they're fixing something and you tell them that something's slow, often the conversation turns into, it's fast on my device, or I don't see that problem. And often you don't see that problem because you're testing it in your office, and in your office you're connected to a Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi happens to be the faster connection, while your users are actually on cellular connection. When they are in train, or when they are on train stations, when they are in tube, they don't get any Wi-Fi. So you need to care for those users as well. And in this case, the response time on cellular network seems to be about 876 milliseconds, so about almost close to 1 second, versus on Wi-Fi, it's much faster, a little over half a second. You need to understand that distinction. With that, I want to just quickly summarize the questions we analyzed. So one is, how are your omni-channel users moving across different platforms? Are you tracking the right KPIs? Can you quickly resolve the problems? Are you solving the problems for the right user set? How are software applications impacting your business performance? With that, I'll leave you guys with three thoughts. One is, know your users, but also know your development environment and connect those two data points together. And don't just build the features, transform your organizations for future. When you see the next speech interaction, when you see next virtual reality interaction, the answer shouldn't be, we need to get onto that because that seems to be the next wave. The answer should be, how do we transform ourselves so we are meeting our customers' requirements for future? That may include supporting speech interaction, that may include supporting speech interaction through Google Home or through Alexa, but understand what that future organization looks like. And then believe in connected data points. There are a lot of people who can collect data, and they can post the data. AppDynamics collects about 1 billion data points every minute. It's a huge amount of data, but if we gave you every single data point, there would be no insights. It would almost be not useful. So a connected data point is important. Connect these data points from your marketing funnel, your return on investments on the marketing, to your product behavior, to your software applications. Because all those are connected pieces. That's how your user sees it. Your user doesn't see your application as a software application and a marketing team and a product team and an HR team. With that, I'll open up for questions. Also interested in hearing your thoughts. Thank you. Thank you. We'll pass the mic around if there are questions. Yeah, over here.
Hello. Okay, my question here is, end user monitoring without application performance monitoring, how relevant is that? Because quite often, when you look at your end user performance monitoring, you come across and see that on the BTM side, the performance is quite okay, as per my experience. And the issues normally is on the end user, user side. And so far, we do not have any good metrics available on the network, which is from end user perspective to the APM side. So how much value does it give to do deep dive?
Yeah, I think you have partially answered your questions, your question yourself. You said that the most of the problems happen on the end user side, and it happens on the network side. So how relevant is end user monitoring?
Yeah, my concern here is that, for example, the APM side, you give a very good visibility about, you go deep dive into the code, call a stack, and you actually identify that. Yeah. Whereas on the end user, say for example, it is taking 2 seconds, and BT is taking only a few milliseconds. And then we look at and we see, okay, network here and there. Yeah. But it doesn't give any good clue about where to look at.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I'll try to answer your question in 2 ways. One is, yes, it's super important. I think it's important to not only look at when you deep dive into the problem as to whether the problem is on the back-end side or not. It's almost more important to know that the problem is on the front-end side, and if it's the problem on the front-end side, is it the network portion that's causing the problem? Is it the code that's causing the problem? To answer your question, it's super important. To answer your question from an AppDynamics perspective, the team's working on something where we call graphs for client-side performance. And these call graphs right now we only give you this call graph or stack trace for crashes. But in the network cases, the call graph doesn't exist today. It would exist in near future. But then you would be able to get full visibility into what were the call methods and how long did it take for each of those to execute. There are some workarounds today where you can use custom timers. You can use other ways of adding custom data points to say, from the start point to end point, how long did it take to execute. And that's possible today, but it's frankly not an answer that we are looking within AppDynamics for. So we are trying to solve it in a much more sophisticated way.
Another question on the same line, like we are talking about network monitoring, which is the new feature. Yeah. So network monitoring, are we talking about only between tier to tier? or are we talking about from end user?
End user too. So browser already does that. It gives you a breakdown of this is how much your JavaScript took to load. This is how much your network took to reach to your servers. And then this is how much time your server took. It breaks it down. Mobile doesn't do it today. Again, something that we have plans for future. But part of the product does that today.
Thank you.
Yeah. So question here. And while there are questions, if you guys have feedback, feel free to go and give some feedback for the session.
Sorry, you're saying the network latency right now is not quite available. Would it be? Do you know if it's possible to? Do you know the way you can build a metric from an expression within the metric browser? Is there a way of, say, if you have a login and you have the APM monitoring all of the back end, you have that login defined as a business transaction, and you have a set response time for that to execute. Can you use that and then also use the mobile metric of what the customer experienced and take one away from the other to find out what the network latency is?
So let me correct my answer. There is a network latency is available today on the end user product, including mobile, browser, and so on. The earlier point was when there is latency, you want to find out what the root cause of that latency is. You don't have the code level visibility as to what is causing it on the front end side. You do have that visibility on the APM side. So today on all our products, including browser and mobile, you get latencies on what's the 90th percentile, 50th percentile. You can build charts and graphs on how is it moving across time. In the metric browser, apply expressions to that. So all of that is possible by application, by platform, and by APM side as well.
So you can put all of the different data from the different areas into one expression within the metric browser.
Well, you'd have hard time putting, let's say, the one browser, mobile, other devices all in one chart, but you can certainly do it in multiple charts that are put together in the same place.
Cool.
Okay. Other questions? All right. Thank you for joining me today. There's a great closing keynote that's happening right after this. There are some very cool hackathon projects. There's also a sneak peek into IoT product that is coming up very soon. So you should go take a look. And thanks for joining me today. All right.